Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and this time we are going to be debunking every single lie about Nintendo Switch 2. A few days ago, I did try to clarify on some of the Switch 2 confusion while also offering up some different strategies to save some money on Switch 2, but since then I've realized that all of the lies and misleading narratives and misinformation are far worse than I thought. I was actually at the gym a couple days ago with my friends, and I was in the middle of a set, and a friend of mine, who I consider to be well-educated, very intelligent, and also fairly knowledgeable on the video games industry, said that they no longer want to pick up a Nintendo Switch 2 because all of the games, physically, are $90. And I freaked out, because that's completely untrue. And so today, what I aim to do is debunk every single lie that has come out about Switch 2, and what I would like to encourage all you watching to do. Yes, I would love it if you could like, subscribe. I do have a goal to hit 50,000 subscribers by the time the Switch 2 comes out, but if there's anything that I ask that you do for this video is to spread the word, spread the truth. I will have all the sources to everything in the description below. Let's try and end this massive spree of lying and misinformation. Because listen, maybe you don't like the Switch 2, maybe you think it's overpriced, and those opinions are totally valid. But think about this for a second. How about for someone who would want to pick up a Switch 2, but will not because they understand the situation inaccurately because people continue to lie about what's actually going on? Why are we going to rob some people the opportunity to enjoy something they want because it's been continually lied about? That's completely unfair. And so let's debunk all the lies and spread the actual truth. So first lie, no. Here in the United States, because that's what the lie has been about the pricing USD, there are no Nintendo Switch 2 games that are $90. In fact, the digital and physical games here in the United States is the same. There is something going on in Europe where they are different, but the false narrative that's going around is how it costs over here. Looking at Nintendo's own website, as you see, the suggested retail price, which means retailers that will be selling it physically, $79.99. It is $80. We even have other sites that are showing the game physically for $80, not $90. Switch 2 games are the same price physically and digitally. And yes, I agree, $80 for Mario Kart World is surprising, but that is just Mario Kart World. All other games are on par with everything you've seen on other platforms that are 4K capable consoles, such as Donkey Kong Bonanza, big deal game coming out in July. It's $70. That's normal for a 4K capable system. But let's move on to the next set of lies. That Nintendo is the only company raising the prices for their Switch 2 edition games. On PlayStation and Xbox, all the upgrades are free. That is not true. It is completely false. There are free upgrades, and then there are paid upgrades. And the same applies to Switch 1. As you see here, here's an entire list of games from Switch 1 that are getting free visual and performance enhancements. So this is the case. I actually really liked this graphic shared by Croco Clock. It does a good job of explaining what's been going on. So there are a variety of games that for free are getting FPS and resolution improvements, but then there are also bigger deals Switch 2 edition games, like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, which by the way, you can get the Switch 2 editions for free through Nintendo Switch Online Plus expansion pack, but games like that or Metroid Prime 4 Beyond that are seeing these enhancements plus some extra stuff like mouse mode, there will be a little bit of a price hike for, yes. But then you look at games like Mario Party and Kirby, which are technically selling for $80. People are freaking out about this because it's other $80 games. But here's the thing, Mario Party and Kirby, these respective games, their MSRPs are also $59.99. They are $60 games. However, the Switch 2 versions include expansions, Jamboree TV, and Star-Crossed World. So really what you're paying for is the expansions. That's why there are those extra $20, and actually, what you can do is that you can find both Mario Party Jamboree and Kirby in the Forgotten Land, and also Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, by the way, for cheaper just for Switch 1 elsewhere at other retailers, and then you can perhaps get the enhancements as they do cost on Switch 2, but you'll still be able to save some money. But another lie that's going around is that Nintendo is not even including their full games on the Switch 2 cartridges. This is not true, and this is understandably a little bit confusing because when we do look at the Switch 2 Edition cases, they say, this Nintendo Switch 2 Edition comprises of the Nintendo Switch game and the Nintendo Switch 2 Edition upgrade pack. And so that wording is perhaps a bit too vague. But because of this, some people have made the assumption, without proof, that this means that Nintendo is not including their entire games on the cartridges. And this is 100% not true. So looking down this article from Vooks, they spoke to a Nintendo spokesperson, and they said, physical versions of Switch 2 Edition games will include the original Nintendo Switch game and its upgrade pack all in the same game card. In other words, those red Switch 2 cartridges will have the entire thing on there. Now, something to note, someone did reach out to the Nintendo Store team about the expansion pass for Breath of the Wild, the DLC we had for Switch 1, and according to the store team, it doesn't look like the Breath of the Wild Switch 2 Edition will include the paid DLC packs. And it's possible there might be some confusion here, but the fact that Nintendo's not marketing that the Breath of the Wild Switch 2 Edition has a DLC, I think does imply that it's not included. You would have to pay separately for it if you haven't bought it already for Switch 1. But let's now move on to the game keycard situation. People have been looking at these game keycards and saying that Nintendo will no longer be putting physical games onto the cartridges. You will have to download everything. And this is not true. And people have also been saying that these game key cards are locked to specific Nintendo accounts, specific systems, and they are not open for resale or trading or borrowing. And this is also not true. So game key cards, as it says here on Nintendo's own support page, are like regular physical software. The game key card must be inserted into the system in order to play the game. Basically, they work very similar to how a disc would work on PlayStation or Xbox. You put it in there, and you're going to have to do a mandatory initial install of the game before playing the game. But if you take out the disc, you can no longer play the game on the console, but if you put that disc on another console owned by a different person with a different account, they will then have to install the game, but they will be able to play it as well. And so game key cards work pretty much in the same way, except they will have to download the whole game. Now we've got some extra clarity, because Nintendo's own Tetsuya Sasaki explained that game key cards aren't permanently tied to a specific Nintendo account. The games can be inserted and played on any Switch 2 console, allowing them to be borrowed, rented, and even resold. In other words, they are not locked to any particular account. Anyone saying that is lying or is misinformed, and the truth is, they can be resold or traded. And so this is actually an improvement over how it was on Switch 1, where there were some third-party games where you would buy the case and there was no cartridge, just a download code. So you wouldn't be able to trade it afterwards, you wouldn't be able to resell it, it was just a download code, there would be no cartridge. And Doug Bowser also explained to The Verge that the game key cards primarily benefit publishers outside of Nintendo, allowing them to sell physical copies of games at retail locations that may exceed the 64GB capacity of regular Switch 2 game cartridges. And so this is for third-party companies. Nintendo has offered this to publishers, that way more games will be on Switch 2. So I understand that some people don't like the idea that we do not have the full game on the cartridge because say years down the road, maybe all the servers are down and you can no longer get access to this game if it's not downloaded onto your console. I can understand that concern, but this is at least an improvement over what it was on Switch 1, where it was just a download code. These are open for resale, which is pro-consumer, and this also allows for other third-party publishers to put more games on Switch 2 than they otherwise would not be able to. Now, something else that's been spread around is that the price for Nintendo Switch 2 is going to go up. And the fact of the matter is, we do not know what is going to happen. But at the very least, what we do understand is that it's not going to at least happen yet. As reported by Bloomberg here, the 90-day reprieve on heightened tariffs for the most US trading partners gives the Japanese company, Nintendo, a chance to ramp up shipments of the Switch 2 to a market that accounts for more than a third of its sales. So at least for the next 90 days, the Switch 2 will be able to launch and its price will not be impacted by tariffs. Now this part's just my own opinion, but I don't think the Switch 2 price is ever going to go up. I have a hard time believing that Nintendo would do that. However, I do think that because of everything that's going on, probably they will never be dropping the price of the console. You look at Switch 1, they still haven't dropped the price even though they just announced Switch 2. But again, that's just my opinion. What we know for now is that at least for the next few months, prices will not be going up. Now, another misleading narrative that's been going around is that the Switch 2 power is just around a PS4. And I don't think this is really accurate at all. As we see here reported by Bloomberg, we believe the Switch 2's bill of materials is around $400 American, meaning Nintendo would still be selling consoles at a loss in the US with the 10% tariff. So based off what Bloomberg understands of Switch 2, they think Nintendo, which they almost never do, are selling this console at a loss. So for those that are trying to argue that this system is of minimal value and that's overpriced, I mean, sure, that's your opinion and you're entitled to it, but it may be the case that Nintendo is actually losing money on Switch 2 sales here. And so I gotta ask myself, why is it so expensive? What have they done with this console? I think they've done a lot with the screen, but I also believe it goes beyond that. As we see with Nvidia here, they're saying that the Switch 2 delivers 10 times the graphical performance of Switch 1. And so if this is the case, Nvidia is responsible for the tech in the Switch 2, then yeah, the Switch 2 is clearly more than just a little bit more powerful than the PS4. Because from what we understand the Switch 1, it's a fraction of the PS4 power, sure, about a third or so. And there's a lot of room for interpretation there, right, in terms of exactly how powerful the Switch is in comparison to the PS4. But with 10 times more power, that clearly has a Switch 2 well above the PS4. There are even some estimates going around that believe the CPU performance might be closer to the PS5 than the PS4. And we also take into consideration that we have games like Cyberpunk and Final Fantasy VII Remake Integrate. Cyberpunk was a game that could barely run on PS4, yet we are seeing solid versions of it on Switch 2. And then with Integrate, that is the PS5 version of Final Fantasy VII Remake, and that's the version they're putting on Switch 2. But let's just consider this. The PlayStation 4 was capable of running games at a 1080p resolution at 60 frames per second. The Nintendo Switch 2 is capable of running games at a 4K resolution while also at a 60 frames per second, as we've seen with Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, or 1080p at 120 frames per second, as we've also seen for Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. And so when you consider all of this, it is so obvious that the Nintendo Switch 2 is more powerful than the PS4. So to say it's just the PS4 is very misleading. Another misleading story that's going around is that the Switch 2 Joy-Cons are going to drift like the Switch 1 Joy-Cons. And this also probably is not the case. It is the case that the Switch 2 is not using Hall effect sticks. From what we understand, they probably are using something very similar. So Nate Bildorf from Nintendo of America was asked, so is it a Hall effect stick? And he responds, well, the Joy-Con 2's controllers have been designed from the ground up. They are not Hall effect sticks, but they feel really good. And here Nate continues, I tried to spend a lot of time making sure that it was quiet. I don't know if you tried really whacking the stick around, but it is really quiet. I'm thinking back to my Smash Bros. Days where you just whack it. The Switch 2 Pro controller is one of the quietest controllers I've ever played. And also it's said here, in particular, the left and right control sticks are quieter and don't make noise, even when they are moved quickly to the edge. Also, they glide very smoothly, so we've taken to calling them smooth gliding sticks. So the control sticks on Switch 2 have been redesigned from the ground up. They are improved, they are smooth, they are quiet, but Nintendo will not say that they are Hall effect. However, Nintendo did have a patent that they published on September 7th of 2023 where they were working with a technology that's essentially very similar to Hall effect technology that they could use in control sticks. And so it's believed that what's actually going on here is that Nintendo doesn't want to pay royalties or acknowledge a different technology. They want to use their own technology that's very similar, but is not quite the same, which is why they are not calling the control sticks in Switch 2 Hall Effect control sticks. And this part's a little bit more speculative, but we do have Next Handheld, this person who is responsible for leaking all the photos of the Switch 2 before Nintendo revealed the console back in January, and they've been told that from teardowns, the control stick is actually Hall Effect. So if this is true, odds are the Switch 2 controller uses Nintendo's own version of that technology, but it's not exactly the same, and so that's why Nintendo is not saying that it's Hall Effect. So the point is, there's not really any reason to think that the Switch 2 Joy-Cons are going to drift more than any other control stick, and actually, we have evidence to the contrary that probably they're going to work pretty well. Now, another interesting story that's been developing is that Nintendo has confirmed that the Nintendo Switch 2 will not be getting achievements, and I say that with air quotes because we've seen that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom actually do have a play data section that will keep track of achievement like medals. And what's interesting about this is it's also been reported that the Nintendo Switch 2 Welcome Tour also has minigames that award medals, and there's been a bit of a conversation from friend of the channel Thunderstash. We actually saw this on the Nintendo Prime podcast yesterday, which will also be linked in the description below, that they might be part of the same system. It's not confirmed yet, it's a developing story, we shall see, but it might be another one of those scenarios where people are quick to jump to conclusions because Nintendo says, hey, we're not technically doing Hall Effect, we're not technically doing achievements, but there might be something that's actually very similar. Now, the last misleading thing that's been going around is that the Gamecube controller for Switch 2 cannot work for anything but Nintendo Gamecube, and this is arguably at the fault of Nintendo themselves because in the fine print they basically say that. However, they also say this for all the other NSO controllers, and these NSO controllers are usable outside of the NSO app. However, their functionality is limited, and so this is probably why Nintendo is using this wording here, because they do not want to promise that you can use the GameCube controller to play any game normally. You probably can't, but you can try and see if it works. And so with that, hopefully I have covered every single lie or misleading story that has been said about Nintendo Switch 2. Again, all the sources are linked in the description below as usual. Don't take my word for it. Look it up for yourself. The proof is there, but I encourage you all to spread the truth. Anyways, everyone, this is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.